My piece over the weekend is called War is Coming. I recall President Obama describing the presidency thus. He said it was like being a train driver. The rails are laid and the directions set, and the president can speed up or slow down, but nothing more. In December 2013, I wrote a piece headlined "The Pivot to Asia Bears Its Fangs," in which article I said, "I see the pivot to Asia as the encirclement of China, then the shrinking of its operating theatre, and then lighting the tinderbox that is the periphery, and Xinjiang might well morph into China's Afghanistan." China has been stuffing the residents of Xinjiang with pork, locking them up in internment camps and brainwashing them in order to prevent that very outcome I was writing about. The Pivot to Asia was the signature name for President Obama's pivot, which entailed a repositioning of US assets into Asia, and which China saw as a US attempt to contain it and bottle it up. If one is to criticize Barack Obama, one would criticize him for being incredibly supine in the teeth of China's salami slicing. And I learned this phrase from Ronak Gopaldas in the ISS. The practice involves the slow accumulation of small changes, none of which in isolation amounts to a casus belli, but which add up over time to a substantial change in the strategic picture, according to military analyst Robert Haddock. This incremental strategy has been employed with considerable success for territorial gains in the South China Sea. In August 2017, I wrote a piece headlined "China Rising," and said apart from a few half-hearted and timid FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations, China has established control over the South China Sea. It has created artificial islands and then militarized those artificial islands across the South China Sea. It is a mind-boggling geopolitical advance, any which way you care to cut it. By March 2018, in a Shakespeare-level moment of hubris, Xinhua pronounced this historical announcement: the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China proposed to remove the expression that the President and Vice President of the People's Republic of China shall serve no more than 2 consecutive terms from the country's constitution. In one fell swoop, President Xi Jinping was president for life. That was the apogee. By July 2018, Trump had launched his tariff war, which I characterize thus: "The method in his madness is the triangulation of China in a serious ratcheting higher of pressure. And I said, Xi is looking more brittle. President Trump, after bashing on Justin Trudeau of Canada and Mexico's Enrique Peña Nieto, now appended of course, and then firing a few broadsides at Europe, has now turned his attention to Xi Jinping and thrown in the keys, challenging him to a cheeky run, and also, for good measure, sent 2 US destroyers into the Taiwan Strait for the first time since 2007. It has now turned out that for all the Trump bluster, when it comes to trade, the likes of the US Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and Peter Navarro, head of a trade policy shop in the White House, have been operating with surgical precision and now have introduced an anti-dragon clause which prevents any country with a free trade agreement with the US from seeking free trade with non-market economies, China, without American consent. The so-called anti-dragon clause, which prevents any country with a free trade agreement with the US from seeking free trade with non-market economies, is designed by Washington's trade hawks as a template for future negotiations with key economies such as the EU, the UK, and Japan, and as a weapon to isolate China. Chinese leaders can be forgiven for seething about this declaration of economic warfare. That's from Asia Nikkei. I've said severally that Trump, who remains a linguistic warfare specialist, has proven a skilled, coercive, sanctioned warfare specialist. Trump's aggressive, coercive foreign economic policy is the signature success of this administration. It is highly effective. Look at Venezuela to see its most extreme output. Iran is in a similar bind. China is in retreat, notwithstanding some bravura talk. Trump can keep it up. It's working a treat, I told Sputnik last month. On trade, Trump is disrupting the Chinese supply chain bigly. This is the point. The FD said the Trump administration's new strategic thrust is more aspirational than operational. But its tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese imports, tightening of rules on Chinese investments in the US, screening of supply chains for national security vulnerabilities, and the boost of military spending by $82 billion are indicators of what is to come. I think the FD is mistaken in its characterization that it is more aspirational than operational. I think the point is, we're seeing it's highly operational. In geopolitical terms, Vice President Pence set out the administration's stall in a speech at the Hudson Institute. SCMP News said Vice President Pence's speech at the Hudson Institute on October 4 was an era-defining statement in the history of diplomacy between the United States and China. It declared a fundamental US policy shift and set a new course for the relationship between the world's two largest economies. Something not seen since US President Richard Nixon stripped China in 1972. Historians might wish to compare Pence's 45-minute policy statement with such historic episodes as George Kennan's 8,000-word telegram in 1946, Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech of 1946, and Harry Truman's Truman Doctrine address to Congress in 1947, all of which unpinned the West's Cold War policy of containment toward the communist bloc led by the then Soviet Union. The importance of the speech cannot be gainsaid. This geopolitical contest will likely escalate dangerously. Powerful forces on both sides are driving the world's two strongest countries towards fully fledged confrontation. That writer who said that is the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard Kennedy School and author of Destined for War. As a candidate, Trump complained that China was raping America. After months of smaller steps, his administration has now pledged to fight back hard on all fronts and win. The US military is reportedly planning to send US warships, combat aircraft, and troops through the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and other contested waterways next month in a series of exercises designed to send a message to Beijing in November. The incident with the USS Decatur, where a Chinese warship came within 45 yards of the USS Decatur in the South China Sea, is surely a precursor. B-52s are buzzing China practically daily. Greg DeJerian responded thus to a question I posed about how best to position oneself in the context of the financial markets. I am frankly concerned well beyond sketching out market positioning, but to your point, one might start with shying away from names that too robustly rely on heavily commingled trans-Pacific supply chains and the like. Let's start with gold, which popped last week to close at 1218.15. It's higher again. The purest geopolitical proxy in the markets is gold. As Ben Bernanke once said, people hold gold as protection against what we call tail risks, really, really bad outcomes. I like the dollar. And every time I hear another fellow talking about the demise of the dollar with that 3 a.m. Ministry of Sound circa the 1990s look in their eye, I want to buy more. The yen also started strengthening. I'm keen to buy the China EM negative feedback contagion loop, which means shorting ZAR into this. Tito Mboweni Boyles. I have a high regard for this man, but many of you might have forgotten what happened the day he was appointed the central bank governor. Quite an interesting development that day. Equities will stay under pressure and wobble last week. With respect to commodities, I think it's best we sell that as well, ex-oil and precious metals. Crude oil is battling a very precarious geopolitical situation with the biggest supplier of crude oil to the world markets, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, signaling loud and clear that its wannabe king is simply not tenable. He was already unconscionable, I know. If you really absolutely must hold some EM exposure, then you should look at the Turkish lira, where it seems maybe, just maybe, President Erdogan has sharpened his skills and flipped the control the yield curve decide the future trade on its head, and boomeranged it with the release of Pastor Brunson and leveraging the extraordinary events in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. I was referring to an article in SCNP News, Fighting Talk. It's Washington versus Beijing after the US. In this, they said that the speech marked a fundamental change in US policy since Nixon. Engagement with China to strategy of disengagement or containment is championed by anti-communist hawks such as Churchill, Truman, McCarthy, and Kennan decades ago. The so-called anti-dragon clause, which prevents any country with a free trade agreement with the US from seeking free trade with non-market economies, China obviously. Any hope that this is Asia Nikkei, any hope that the US and China will hit pause in their rapidly deteriorating ties was dashed by the rare open display of mutual antipathy during Mike Pompeo's brief visit to Beijing, the shortest on record by an American Secretary of State. Instead of patching up a relationship in free fall, the occasion turned into an acrimonious exchange of accusations. Chinese leaders must also have been angered by the new NAFTA agreement, officially the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, signed on September 30. At Washington's insistence, it effectively gives the US a veto over future free deals Canada and Mexico may want to reach with China. Clearly, the geopolitical costs will likely escalate. Dangerously powerful forces on both sides are driving the world's two strongest countries towards fully fledged confrontation. On the American side, Trump's hardline China policy enjoys wide support from a bipartisan coalition encompassing the security establishment, trade hawks, human rights groups, and white nationalists. Previously, I've said that Trump is an avowed linguistic warfare specialist, and he has embraced coercive sanction and financial warfare. 9th July, my piece was Who Blinks First. I was referencing Rebel Without a Cause. 2013, the article I was referring to was The Pivot to Asia Bears Its Fangs.